Hey guys, Stephanie with AmericanMuscle.com here with a review and install of the BMR Lowering Springs fitting 2015 and newer S550 GT Mustangs. We're going to be talking about a few different things with these springs, but mostly we'll talk about what you can expect from these springs in both the performance and looks categories, and we're also going to talk about the install as well. We'll talk more about the install later, but you're looking at a 1 out of 3 wrenches in the difficulty meter. The BMR springs are going to be a good option for the GT owners out there who are looking for a linear spring that'll give an aggressive drop and more aggressive handling. This spring is perfect for those owners out there that are looking to have more of a muscle car stance and still maintain ride quality. Lowering springs have a big impact on both the looks and handling of the S550, and these offer a pretty big drop in the front and slightly less of a drop in the rear. These springs will drop the GT about 1.2 inches in the front and a half an inch in the rear of the car. And like I said, it doesn't get much lower than this for the front of the S550 from a spring, and it may not sound like it, but this is a pretty big drop. Depending on your wheel and tire setup, this drop is going to eliminate a lot of the wheel gap that the car has from the factory, and it's going to leave the car sitting a little above the tires. But of course, that can change depending on what size wheel and tires you're running. Now, a 1-inch drop, or just under a 1-inch drop, is pretty standard across the board for this year range. The car sits pretty high on the factory setup, so the 1.2-inch drop that these springs offer for the front of the car, and even the half-inch drop in the rear, is still aggressive. I mean aggressive in both looks and performance changes. This drop will lower the car's center of gravity enough to create more track-like handling capabilities. These springs are really going to reduce squat during acceleration and reduce wheel hop as well. You're also looking at much less body roll during cornering and less nosedive under braking. Lowering the center of gravity this much means that these springs are really going to change and tighten up the handling of these cars. Now, if you think these springs have too much of a drop for you, or you want to hang on to some of those softer ride quality characteristics, there are a ton of other spring offerings you guys can always check out. Now, these springs do offer a good amount of drop, but this doesn't mean that the springs won't work on a daily driven car. They'll work just fine. It really all comes down to your personal preference and what you want out of the springs. These springs were specifically designed for the street performance crowd, so you can expect to stay away from the rough ride quality features that you can sometimes see with other options that are geared more towards drag racing use. Now, with that being said, I want to mention that these are linear springs. These are not the progressive rate springs that we tend to see that are going to change as you drive. Linear springs have a constant rate of force per inch, so they tend to have one defined spring rate and that's it. So basically, as the load on the springs increase, the spring compresses an amount directly proportional to that load, and this makes a linear spring more performance-oriented than a progressive rate spring. Progressive rate springs are variable rate springs. They have low initial spring rates that increase as the spring is compressed, which makes for a softer and smoother ride quality. But keeping the drop that these particular springs offer in mind, they are still going to work with both the factory wheels and the pre-configured wheel and tire kits that are on the site. These springs aren't going to make the car difficult to drive places, but you will need to be a little bit more careful. They are going to be stiffer than the factory springs as well, so you will notice some more road noise. But I wouldn't say that these give a bad ride quality at all. They're just not as soft as factory. I do want to say that a lot of times when you're shopping for lowering springs, you're also shopping for things like adjustable caster camber plates and a new set of both shocks and struts. In this case, I wouldn't say that caster camber plates are necessarily required. A 1.5-inch drop is about the limit of where you need a set of adjustable CC plates in order to get the alignment back within spec, and these springs won't drop the car that much. But a set of caster camber plates wouldn't be a bad idea at all. At the end of the day, it never hurts to have caster camber plates, so if you've got the extra cash, I'd say go ahead. But in all reality, you will be able to get away without picking up a set. As far as shocks and struts, this goes back to the drop too. I'd say that you can get away with the factory shocks and struts in this case due to the fact that you aren't really slamming the car here, but I would still keep in mind that these are a linear spring, they're not the more forgiving progressive springs, so shocks and struts are something that you might want to consider. I'd say that you can get away with running your stock components if you have some components with relatively low mileage. If your shocks and struts have a ton of miles on them, I would replace them. But in this case, since we're talking about relatively new cars here, you can probably get away without it as long as you don't have a ton of miles. When it comes to price, it all depends on how you buy these springs. BMR offers a full set for just over $200, or you could purchase just the front or just the rear springs. The front springs alone will cost $100, and the rears will cost just over $100, so you do have some options there. Now, as far as price for the set of springs goes, these springs are going to be one of the middle-of-the-road options. They're not the most expensive, but they aren't the least expensive either. If you're just looking to get your car low and you aren't concerned with ride quality, there are some other options on the site that'll cost a little less and will get you where you need to be. So the install here is gonna take about 4 hours, and I'm gonna call it a solid 1 out of 3 wrenches on the scale because you will need some knowledge to complete the install. So I'd recommend having a knowledgeable helping hand or taking this to a shop for the install if you haven't done this before, especially since it's always a good idea to get an alignment after the install anyway. This install can be done on jack stands if you don't have access to a lift, but as usual, a lift would be your best bet here. You're gonna need a few tools, including a spring compressor, so make sure you have that before you start the install. You're gonna need to get down to the spring and strut assemblies, so everything like the wheels, the brakes, the ABS lines will need to be moved out of the way so you can pull the assemblies out of the car. The spring compressor will help you remove the spring from the strut and install the new front springs, which are compressed and installed the same way. The strut assemblies go back the same way they came out, and the install is the same for both sides. The rear is where things are a little different, but nothing crazy here. Essentially, the IRS subframe will be dropped along with the rear shock mount so you can slide the rear springs out. Just like the front, the rear springs installed the same way that they were uninstalled, so there's no surprises there. New bump stops are slid onto the shocks, followed by the factory dust boots. The new springs can be installed and the IRS subframe can be bolted back up, and that's about all it's gonna take. Like I mentioned earlier, a fresh alignment after the install isn't a bad idea. Wrapping things up here, the BMR Lowering Springs are a linear spring with an aggressive drop and improvements in handling that'll make for a street car that feels track ready. They'll drop the car 1.2 inches in the front and a ½ inch in the rear, giving a muscle car stance. The springs are not difficult to install. They're in the middle of the pack as far as pricing goes, and you can check them out more online right here at AmericanMuscle.com.